Who goes first? No, left to right? Right to left? Center, left, right? Okay. Good. So out of those three names, I'm the one that's James Lowder. And so, what happened there? There we go. Different program. Okay. So for me, I guess for me, this conversation about fabrication really has to deal with the sort of, and I'm coming from someone who's, most of my teaching has been revolving around geometry, and I've been teaching descriptive geometry here for a long time, but also teaching sort of digital electives, which have been dabbling with this notion of fabrication and what that means today. And so one of the things I think for me it's always been important is sort of the relationship between geometry and matter, right? That somehow architecture really kind of is born out of the sort of how does one begin to discipline matter through geometry, right? And so, and that in and of itself is not only a sort of technical problem, but also a representational problem. So, and I would argue that for a big portion of architecture's, as a discipline's life, representation has always been sort of the driving force. So this is actually some of the unrolled elevations of the original World Trade Center towers, and showing that in actuality, all those different colors are actually the different steel grades in the building. So even though there's a sort of homogeneous formal organization with the facades, there's actually lots of heavy lifting done by different alloys and different gradients of materiality just to basically make that legible. A more extreme case of that, even that one could argue like at the beginning, right, the sort of the primitive hut, the raw materiality of wood itself is somehow, even though it's so explicit, it's trying to be suppressed in favor of the sort of the organization of geometry, right? And even something like this, where in Eisenman's work, early work, this notion of cardboard architecture, where form is something that is that basically, ideally for him, the building reads as cardboard. There's zero material expression. That form is purely notational, right? So somehow materiality is something that's completely denied in the expression. So I think, and again, this is some of the things I can, for me, and then I think what's been happening lately is that there's been more of a sort of interest in how we've kind of beat up form and have enough control over form that there's been a sort of renewed interest in like what's the sort of expressive range of materiality. And so this is actually two exercises we did in the geometry class, which I think began to kind of touch on that. One was essentially, how do I begin to develop a surface through geometry where the materiality is completely subservient to the geometric logics, versus something like this, which was the sort of called the graphic morphing model, where the model was made out of foam and the operation was sanding. So basically it was something much more granular, and there's a sort of reciprocity between the act of making the object and its material qualities and drawing, right? So if I were to, the drawing of this was actually a very different thing than the end result. So I think for me, and then again, some things I think we've been trying to do in the seminars, because I mean, unfortunately, I kind of here at Cooper, we're just now starting to get a lot of these new devices, but I would also argue that the technology in and of itself is not actually the driver of the in and of itself is sort of this change, but actually is a sort of actually allowed for a certain change in thinking and how we begin to think materiality. So these are actually two pieces where basically it says that in fabrication today, there's a sort of an idea that material resists being geometrically disciplined. That somehow there's another mechanism, the sort of the wildness of the material somehow allowed to be expressed and made thematic in the work. Or two is sort of material transformation, that the materials sort of act upon in a way, in a very disciplined manner, to reveal a different range of properties that maybe ordinarily would not be considered to be good. Or three, hacking into the material processes to discover, reveal other aesthetic possibilities. This is actually someone who went to a glass manufacturer who basically asked them how they kind of made this non-reflective glass. And essentially, in the process of making the glass, when it's super hot, they spray an argon gas in there, which fuses with the glass, which makes it hyper-transparent. So basically, he was like, what if we did 10 times the amount of argon gas? What would happen? And so on the left side, basically, is what happens when you have 10 times the amount of glass, becomes highly reflective and becomes purple. This is what happens when you kind of use the spray at different intervals, and it produces different levels of, basically produces a different range of material expression. So yeah, for me, those are kind of the three things I'm kind of putting on the table for conversation.
That's awesome. So that is material that resists being geometrically disciplined.
Mm-hmm.
Material that's disciplined in an unconventional way.
Mm-hmm.
And hacking into material history. Sorry, where do I go?
What is that?
Cool. Let's see. Wrong operating system. So for fabrication, I thought I'd start with this image. This is a drawing by Henry Labrouste during the Beaux-Arts era, and you could look at it as a kind of fabrication exercise from the 18th century, late 18th century. And the drawing is called the Reconstitution of an Old Ruin. And what Labrouste is doing here is imagining new possibilities out of the foundation of an old ruin. And for me, fabrication, and I would say more generally, our practice, when I say us, my professional practice, Aranda Lash, and also some of the teaching, builds off this idea of how to treat history as a generative device, or history itself, with all of its kind of cultural baggage, as something that you can work with. So whether that's a building, this is a commercial building in Miami, where we looked at Art Deco as a historical device, and how to transform Art Deco through ideas of fabrication, through ideas of reinterpreting Art Deco with a different kind of rhythm. It's fabricated by using concrete, but a very kind of thin, strong concrete that allows you to make very large panels, very large pieces. But when it goes back into the site, for us, this idea of dealing with Art Deco, dealing with history, became very interesting within the context of Miami, where the sunlight is actually very strong. And we realized after the project was over that maybe this whole idea in history was about understanding the site in a different way, and basically rendering the Miami sunlight in a certain way. So I think I also have three ideas to counter this. So history is generative. I think also working with cultural tradition and ritual. This is a very long project in our practice where we work with Native American Indian basket weavers, specifically the Tohono O'odham nation, which produces traditionally baskets that look like this on the lower left. And essentially the basket is a coil. So that means it's a strand of grass that you twist in a spiral. So it produces a kind of flat disc. But our interest with them over the years was taking that premise of the coil and really it's been 12 years now, working with the same weavers, just trying different things out. And in many ways, trying to release the coiling into 3 dimensions and also into new material possibilities. So these are some, and you know, we've done, I would say, hundreds of these at this point with them. But some of them are successful and some of them are maybe not. I think we really appreciate the ones that push the basket weaving medium. We work with them to use their materials, so they walk through the desert, find the grasses and the bushes. We provide the kind of structure and some of the motifs, but it's very much within their language of the tribe. So the Tohono O'odham weave has certain certain signals that are definitely from them, and they're still present in even moments like this, where you can see the spacing of the bundling, or how the creosote grass hits this little woven weave here. That's all very much about the Tohono O'odham tribe. And then finally, so generative history, being historical, working with ritual, and finally, working with material that is culturally relevant. So this is a project that was a landscape project where we were asked to do something in Indiana, and we decided to use limestone. And it's a very large circle that organizes all of these activities in it. Indiana produces a lot of limestone. The Empire State's Building is made of Indiana limestone. And there's a lot of waste that comes out of the process of producing limestone. So, in fact, tons of limestone an hour is wasted and eventually goes into these landfills. So we didn't have much of a budget for this project, and we decided, well, let's talk to these mills and see if we can get our hands on some of this waste. And we did. So we had a zero material budget, $0 material budget. So the project was ultimately about how do you organize trash, or how do you organize refuse, and how do you do it in a way that still organizes human activity. So we were able to define these areas where people could do things, gather, sit down, rest, and the fabrication moment of this exercise was how to actually build this. So we had a few thousand pieces of rock, and we converted all of these points into GPS points. So we used, the entire budget of the project basically went towards these 6 individuals, professional contractors, masons in Indiana, who know limestone very well. And essentially, they had a little GPS emitter, so something better, like more high resolution than what your phone can do. And so they walked around with this map and their phone, and on this phone, they were given an exact coordinate within a couple of inches. And when they got to that coordinate, they were told what to do. And essentially, they were given simple instructions like, build this high, or put the rock at an angle. But they were only given those instructions. So I think in terms of a fabrication exercise, we really left it up to them. So they had to follow these very simple instructions, which had to do with location and height and orientation. But everything else was really up to them. And it really was this moment where we relinquished a lot of control. Like you usually equate fabrication with control, and you usually equate digital fabrication with higher degrees of control. But this was an important project for us because we figured out a way to let go of a lot of the expression of the project and hand it over to a builder, and let them get excited about how to build this thing, how to arrange it, and so when we arrived on site to look at the piece during its construction, it was really like a surprise each and every time, because nothing Nothing was known to us, only location, height, and orientation. So, so history, ritual, and letting go of control, I think, are my ideas.
I don't have a particular thesis statement or central set of argument that I'm pursuing with these slides, but rather I'm only going to present 5 slides, and I'll use each one as a prompt to talk about a topic that has come up in my research or the work that I've done. And some of these are built projects, some of these are research that's ongoing. So the first prompt that I'll start with is what I'm considering non-standard. If we think through fabrication as a space with a very high degree of freedom, there's a lot of complexity. In field versus a model are dramatically different environments. So fabrication largely builds itself upon narrowing that freedom and that kind of dimensionality of space by standard operating procedures, which I consider best practices. And that leads us to a kind of material culture that's very standardized. Oftentimes we call it stock. The term stocks seems like it has a political undertone of what we've made inert, what we've made into a 4 by 8 by 3/4 inch piece of material. So one prompt in the notion of fabrication that I'm interested in is how to look at non-standard materials and how those have a kind of integrity or an intelligence to them that can be engaged, which I think came up in Jim and in Ben's talk. So the one on the left is a small piece I did called Polymer that's cut on a robot arm all out of party bowls. So I sourced them from Party City, digitize the object, and then treat that as a stock. And so it's a commodity with its own history and its own use and its own kind of social affordances. But what does it do when it's enlisted into the fabrication process? And then on the right is mud, compressed mud, and exploring with ways in which we have standard casting materials, but yet there's this history and a long ritual, in fact, of people constructing architecture out of earthen materials that gather together, tamp it down. The chemistry and the structural properties of the material are very integral to the ecosystem and the culture that they're a part of. So what is the nature of non-standard, and what are the politics of stock in general? This relates in a bit to Ben's project. The next prompt I'm going to call semi-auto, which is a question of fabrication where it responds to a notion of automation or a relinquishing of control by a human designer or author towards a system. Oftentimes those systems can be cybernetic systems, but I think that's a farce, and a lot of the tropes of automation and fully automated luxury fabrication is kind of hyperbole. So this project was a workshop I did with a collaborator, Dan Taeyong, at Tsinghua University in Beijing, where we also used phones, and it was a response in some way conscientiously to the culture of using robot arms to build brick walls, which is a very prevalent thing, where we build a digital model that gets converted into G-code or motion control code on the robot, and then it's executed. So what we do here is we build a model of a wall in a digital environment, and then we're streaming that over the internet to a phone and utilizing the phone's GPS and accelerometer to basically identify what the orientation of each brick is and try to align the phone itself towards what the orientation of the model that it's telling it to do. So it's assisted in the way that the phone is informing the hand where to go, but people inevitably put it in an inaccurate position, at least according to the rigor or the precision of the model. So it's designed to, the inconsistencies in the orientation of that are then designed to reconstruct the model. So the model is trying to rebuild itself, in which case if a person were to place a brick in the wrong place, the course on top of that would try to respond to resolve it structurally. And to me, that's kind of underlying this interest in fabrication as a form of interaction design, where we're looking at the feedback between ourselves and a model and allowing it to be a kind of loop, a cybernetic loop. And in the process of designing a model and relinquishing control over that, there's a level of improvisation, which is oftentimes tolerance or an absence of precision, but how can that be an asset or a feature, not a bug? And so I like the notion of human-computer interaction when building with models, because in certain ways, if they're designed in loops, they can inform each other. It's kind of a game or a kind of dialogue between a grasshopper model and human hand. Another prompt that I'm interested in is choreography. Project on the left is a project that I built with my studio, Hello Everything, in collaboration with August Kano in Kenya. And on the right is a workshop I did at the AIA about a year ago. And oftentimes when we talk about fabrication and constructing things, we talk about how people take material and put it together. Construction workers construct the building. So they acquire the material orders, the cement trucks, etc., and then get to work laying it in its proper place with a high level of surveying, precision, instruments, geotechnical systems, etc. But part of the choreography that I think is particularly interesting is that in the process of fabricating, the materials fabricate us, and they make us, and we have to dance or manipulate ourselves in response to what we make. And as much as a person who swings an axe all day, every day, their body will change in a fundamental way. And so part of the curiosity for me in fabrication is understanding the role in which these material assemblages which we construct go back and reconstitute us, reconstitute our behavior and our organization. And I think that's an interesting social question. And it gets us, again, away from thinking in a unidirectional manner of, architect conceiving of a design, and construction worker manipulates material to make a thing, but in fact, we are constantly being reassembled and reformatted ourselves in the process of building. And that has profound effects to describe perhaps fabrication more in terms of a choreography of people, less about what parts go where and individual and elements connecting via details, etc. Another question that I have related to fabrication is this notion of accretion, and I think that this is maybe a moment to stop and say that the notion of the sort of social practice of fabricating, the community identity, and the construction of culture through fabrication, I think, is really integral to what we understand fabrication to be. And so oftentimes I think of these material systems as kind of a hardware. They're not very interesting, to be honest. They're pipes and clamps and bolts and nuts or foam. But there's a software running it that is the sort of informal or tactical kind of communication between people. And so as we look at fabrication as a kind of material accretion of social dynamics, such that it's less an object in and of itself, but a sort of material index, a kind of memory, or a trace left behind by a group, by a conversation of people. So the piece on the right is at MIT, and it's opened into a large public space, a lobby with 500 stacks, 500 individual units all laid in stacks with no operating instructions, and people pick them up and figure out that they can interlock into each other. And across the course of the day, you watch the thing get digested and then reconstructed continuously as people pass through the space. And it's this kind of trace, this artifact that's imprinted by circulation and by people. The last one I'll say, this is a process photo for a cooperative that I co-founded in Brooklyn. And it's dedicated towards art, technology, and architecture collaboration and research. And it's about 25 people, and I'm one of the main organizers of it. And in a place like New York, just to speak specifically about the dynamics of New York, I think there's been a really strong economic de-incentivization to make things through zoning, real estate, just pure economics 101 of the way the city operates. So to try to introduce into New York City fabrication, I think is a challenging thing to do, because oftentimes the labor that's favored by the kind of architecture or the spaces that we find ourselves in is really geared towards a kind of digital work, or a work that's not necessarily made for production. The Midwest or New Jersey is the place where things get fabricated, not New York. So it's a political act to try to reinscribe fabrication back into New York City. And I want to say that as part of the fabrication process, it's always a group effort. It's very hard to build something by yourself. And how is there a way in which constructing something together is a means of kind of brokering trust? I think material or fabricated systems are a way of enabling trust amongst other people that otherwise don't have that. And there's a mass and an inertia to materiality that allows people to have more nuanced or more trusting social interactions. So how can that be designed in a way to not just be a space for making or researching, but just for living? Like fabrication is a life practice and about how people meet each other and live with each other and work with each other. So that's 5 open-ended prompts. I think that's it. Thanks.
That's great, guys.
Thanks.
All right, what do you want to talk about? I have an initial thought if you want something just thrown out there. One line that somehow I just saw between the 3 of you, and I guess I'll ask this if this has any relevance, or you see it having any relevance to the arguments about fabrication. John Ruskin's English arts and crafts movement. The idea that the history would be local. For him, that would be the Gothic in England. That the craftsmen would be empowered to have a certain purview over the ornamentation, and that it would develop almost, I don't know if he uses the word ritualistically, but it would develop as a social practice over time that involved the people making it, the material that was pushing back, in this case, for him, stone, and wood at another level too. So I guess the question, or just the thought is, do we see digital fabrication now in a kind of continuity with the arts and crafts movement? Are we moving at that place? Are we bringing that back in? Or if not, then is it different, and how would it be different? And what are the ways in which that becomes a continuity that we think through in architecture?
If there's a tendency in the historical craft movement for people to inscribe their own sort of behavior, their own personality or narrative into the work that they do, and a kind of more direct translation of human ingenuity to material. I think that that story is largely formed by people, told for people, or the products are used by people. And as soon as you introduce increasingly complex machines into that narrative, it seems as though the audience or the generators of the story become human and also non-human in a really interesting way. So in the notion of the kind of locality of production in craft, I think it's fascinating because the creators of, I see this kind of craft movement as strongly narrative oriented in the sense of say a potter or a ceramicist spinning a pot on a wheel would inscribe reliefs onto it that would tell a story, or in their glazing about a particular event, etc. So in the relation of craft to narrative, I think it's a really nuanced and interesting narrative, because it's not all being told by people in a way. The machines are authors too, and maybe also audience, and that kind of dialogue back and forth, I think, definitely has strong tethers back to like Ruskin's arts and crafts movement. But the generators of the work and the audience of the work is now an assemblage of people and technology in new kinds of loops.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, I can't really speak for the workers of that point in time, but certainly for myself, I think coming out of the 90s and early noughts, there was a real frustration with what we were given as tools and methodologies, and I think I'm part of a generation that really wanted to hack like their way through what we were given, and maybe the arts and crafts movement had a similar idea of finding their own agency or kind of modes of empowerment, but I think specifically to my generation, or just relating this autobiographically, the idea of computation, which has totally changed now in the last, I would say, since 2016, a little earlier, maybe 2012. Before the housing crisis, computation was used in this discipline as a way of undermining ideas of not really what to build, but even how to build and why you would build in the first place. There was this idea that you could really use sophisticated modes of fabrication to tell a different story and to really to not just find your voice, but really really question things fundamentally and propose new outcomes. I think honestly since the housing crisis, that view of technology has really shifted. So, this idea of relating things back to the arts and crafts movement, I guess I would wonder if, what sort of crisis they ran into along the way. What kind of economy forced a kind of rewriting of their moment in time, just as much as we're being forced to rethink ours. I mean, certainly, you cannot bring up like a conversation about fabrication right now cannot be had in purely like teleological terms, right? We can't just Bible thump here and say like fabrication is amazing. It has an amazing tomorrow. There's no problems with it. It's rife with problems, and we are, we're sort of dealing with that now. I think with what's happening in society at large. So, one undercurrent that I noticed in the presentation is this idea of like how do you walk that line where that the discipline is deeply engaged in pushing methods of fabrication, because you have to get underneath the hood. You have to be critical of how you're building something, but how do you do it in a way that is aware of social agency, of I think a big one that you mentioned for me is like how do you unleash the power of like collective construction? We're all walking around with this thing. We all have problems with how our voices are either being heard in the wrong way or being not heard at all. And we do want to figure out a way to get it right. And I think it's like a collective endeavor. And I think you're right to point out that one of the great things about architecture is that it still offers society a chance for a large-scale, very large-scale, assembled collective effort to put something together. And that's, I think, research and fabrication is like this idea that we can do it in a way that addresses some of the things that aren't going right.
Yeah, no, I think that's. For me, what's going on now is less of a sort of return to arts and crafts, or I think it's a different model altogether. Because I think that's more akin to what modernization did to the arts and crafts movement. So I think there's a sort of other. I think the past 5 years, I think we've seen this sort of what we used to refer to as digital culture has actually transformed so radically, and I think its social, cultural, political effects have been so, in some senses, devastating, in other ways, enabling, that I think for me, like it's I mean, on the one hand, it is like, how do we as architects begin to, I guess have an agency within that, and that's a huge untapped resource, and you don't even know how to engage it. But on the other hand, I think on the other hand, it's also like how does one begin to not only like it's also what we do. It's like how does one begin to find a whole other aesthetic range within that. And so on the one hand, the sort of aesthetic range is sort of expression is sort of one thing. Like how does one begin to, through one's own discipline, begin to find modes of expression that speak to a larger cultural push? I think that's always the, architecture's, on one hand, yes, is paradoxically autonomous and has its own problems as a discipline, but also it's always has to be confronted with the larger social, cultural problems of that time. Otherwise, it ceases to be meaningful. So, yeah, I think for me, like I think another one of the underlying topics or things was like this notion of control, and I think how does one begin to I think the push towards frustrating that control is something I is super interesting for me. I'm not sure why I feel the need to do that, but it definitely is there. So yeah, I don't know. But I think that's sort of the larger question also, like how does it now create a sort of a different social condition is right. And I think that there's something for me also the sort of the interplay between the human and non-human. Also, I think unlike the arts and crafts where it was something local, it somehow reinforced a local culture somehow and a local ecology. This somehow expresses the notion of anotherness that is both somehow fascinating but also kind of terrifying, but somehow we're engaging it. Something for me that's been like I've been thinking about a lot is how someone was talking about how they were watching the artificial intelligence play either Go or chess with a computer, and how it never lost. How basically it either beat the computer out of 100 games, beat the computer like 22 times, or tied it 7, the other times. And basically, it's like watching that thing play chess was the closest thing I could imagine to having like an alien race coming and playing chess and watching how something else thinks. And so I think for me, that's also like part of the deal. It's like how does that begin to, I don't know what that means for us as a sort of larger, as a discipline and a sort of and a culture. But yeah.
It makes me think like the classic Alan Turing formulated that a machine could pass the Turing test if you could not discern if it was a human being or a machine, right? And there's still this bias inside. I know we might be leaning a little bit towards computation and not fabrication per se in this, but there's this assumption that intelligence is human-like, right? And so embedded in the Turing test logic is the assumption that it is intelligent if it looks intelligent like us. And as we as designers increasingly navigate increasingly complex apparatuses and infrastructures of technology and social systems, I think it's an interesting question to unravel the ways in which there's intelligence in the systems that we're working within that we can't even perceive, per se, because it's not our own. As you said, like AlphaGo is like the closest thing we might get to an alien logic. Yeah. And there is intelligence in the systems that we use that I think, and this might sound a little far-fetched, but is intelligent in ways that we can't perceive. Because we've been habituated to think that intelligence looks like human intelligence. So the extent to which there's a parallel, and I feel like there's an underlying conversation about hacking happening here. And if there was a system at one point where there was a technique which was in the first industrial revolution, industrialized so that machines were doing this process. Now, a huge amount of what we talk about with fabrication is hacking into these existing systems that are now made to have them have an alternate set of outputs or an alternate sort of consequence. And it's less about making something in authenticity or of an original aura per se, but finding room inside of existing infrastructures and technical systems to redirect it towards an alternate end. And that's, I think, quite different than a culture of just producing something purely on its own 2 feet as if it was sort of made. This is more like modifying or tweaking these systems in the way that they control things to help fabricate. And it's harnessing the power of this kind of network infrastructure that we're a part of to produce architecture in alternate ways and not just high-rises or condos with the maximum FAR, et cetera. And so that modification question, I think, becomes integral to fabrication now because there's so many systems already autonomously running that are making things. So how do we insert ourselves back into it and rechannel it or change it, its control? phones is like a good example of that, I feel like, right? Like everybody has their phones in our hands. And they have so much capability. They have the capability to do really interesting things architecturally speaking, and not just be a tether to surveil every aspect of our body towards the cloud. But how does that socio-technical infrastructure, how can that be hacked and reworked as a way to generate, a collective kind of fabrication? And there's a lot of craft in manipulating those.
Could we
Go ahead.
make questions?
Yeah.
Sorry that I missed
All of it.
your presentations, but I was thinking, there's something very interesting that you said, a reversal of a process that I would like you to maybe to talk a little bit more about, which is that machines now take a role of an audience, and at the same time, humans are now the subject of the transformations of those processes of fabrication, and I'm trying to come up with an example to have that more clear in my mind. And I'm thinking of the work maybe of Eyal Weizman, and how now with drones and killer drones, you could assume that in itself could be the production of those images, the navigation of the drones through previously programmed algorithms, and the subject of those killing machines being now the humans. Maybe that's one of the examples that I could come up. But I would like you, if possible, to talk a bit more about that reversal.
Yeah. To start with an example from visual culture, Harun Faroki has a term he calls operational images, which he made a lot of documentaries about, which are fantastic if anyone hasn't seen them. He's a German documentary filmmaker, and he was really fascinated by the production of images not for people but by other machines. So he looked at a lot of like surveillance monitor cameras in factories, quality control systems, computer vision or motion capture systems that were images produced to not be viewed by people, but to be absorbed by a machinic audience in a way. And now we just kind of generally refer to that as data. But just to try to take a chip away at your really big and interesting question, if we think of, say, a lot of the infrastructures in, say, the global north or in the United States as being networked and kind of cloud platforms, if we used to have brick and mortar shops down Main Street, not to be romantic, that are now completely subsumed by Amazon and fulfillment centers, I would argue that the audience, or a data center is another example, those are examples of architecture where the audience is not people. I think it's for forklifts and for machine or like agents like Kiva roving floor robots, or even just server racks. And so the use case of the audience, not only are these things computationally generated to be the most efficient or optimal spatial layout possible with climate control, etc., but in fact the things using the buildings aren't really people either. And so that kind of question of like cloud architecture, and a lot where we see this mass consolidation of what used to be a disaggregated, distributed world of shops run by people is now consolidated into these kind of infrastructural architectures. And the audience and the architect are both being sort of automated. And I think that tendency will continue to happen because it's an optimization game in machine brains because you can just process things faster than we can. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but one example of the sort of relationship of authorship and audience with humans and computers, or humans and machines.
Can I ask you guys a question now about pedagogy? About how each of you view, because each of you teach a course and have taught courses and we'll just call it digital fabrication to have a big umbrella term. And what I wanted to do to prompt it is at a certain level, let's say when I was in school, and I hate these strawmen, but we're going to set it up anyway. The model was actually an extension of descriptive geometry, I would argue. It was about gaining control of the computational environment in trying to master it, to learn everything it could possibly do, to do it correctly, so that we wouldn't be doing old things with new tools, but we would try to understand the quote-unquote right way to use computation in its kind of environment. But that was really about control. And one of the things that's running through all of your presentations is how do we relinquish that control, or subvert that control, or hack that control, or give it over to material, or give it over to people, or give it over to non-humans. And I would think that produces a different pedagogy for a fabrication course.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, for me it's been a bit trickier because I think I've been teaching here, and I think for the longest time our facilities weren't that robust to allow for that much digital fabrication. So I think for me it was much more about like what were the kind of the larger questions that digital fabrication allowed and changed ways of thinking. So I totally agree. Like, so I think I had the same exact experience, right? To a certain degree, how, and I remember I was in school when there was a sort of the shift from drawing by hand to basically doing digital modeling, going right into Maya, and the kind of things that we were interested in as problems, even when we were drawing by hand, were kind of anticipated the things that we were doing digitally, right? So I think the sort of the loss of ground, how does one begin to beat up the orthogonality, right? From even doing things like you do a drawing for a little bit, then you turn the paper, rotate the paper, and then draw that. So like there was all these kind of or how do you even like work solely in physical model as a way to kind of beat up that relationship, or lofting, etc. And I think for me, I think a big part was saying like that kind of got exhausted as a sort of set of problems. We end up getting all the control we wanted. We couldn't make something squishy enough or bent enough to where it was still a contour. And so I think one of the things for me is like that sort of interplay became like, okay, now that we kind of math geometry is no longer the issue, materiality, and that to me, like, still fabrication is a sort of the dialectic between geometry and materiality. Materiality then did kind of produce a whole other set of range of questions. And so how did it all of a sudden, so I think, even like turning one of my seminars was like, how does one begin to look at drawing as not as a sort of representational problem, but as a sort of material problem, right? Drawing as a material practice all of a sudden made it a different thing. And so how do we begin to even like introduce, I think we were also looking at some craft-based things like, even like paper marbling in a weird way, it's a sort of like really highly digital operation where you kind of, that, and at the end of the day is actually where you don't have, there's a sort of like, even like breathing on the surface of the water, produce some sort of pattern, but at the same time you had like these grids of needles that were kind of like coming in and doing something. So there was a sort of larger, that was like one of the sort of the frameworks we kind of used. Like, how does one kind of hop over not having a certain range of tools, but how does one basically still think that way? And so I think materiality and basically letting not subverting material to a geometric logic, but having it sort of resist a geometric logic, for me, is kind of one of the ways that happened.
Yeah, I would say the objective of any pedagogy is to see how it interfaces with the students, and every generation of students changes, and I don't think that means that you that you change everything with every new year. It's often quite interesting how the fundamentals of, say, drawing or modeling, translating, rotating, multiplying things in space. It's fascinating how those are reinterpreted with each new class, and it's that's what I enjoy about certainly the pedagogy has changed over, let's say, 15 years of digital kind of work, but the ethic of teaching fundamentals for me hasn't. like the idea that you need to build your own tools is for me like fundamental. Like you have to get under the hood. You have to intimately understand what you're working with, because those are the revelatory moments. Does it mean that we have to do it in the same way every time? No. I mean, maybe, certain things change. Maybe there is more of an interest in material production. But I still stand that there are, you can't let go of the idea of just running through fundamentals. And that's never going to go. No matter how sophisticated the incoming student is. And they are getting more and more sophisticated. They have more and more experience with software as they come in. They certainly know how to use this thing much better than any of us do. To be very clear about it, the objective of using computers, and specifically of hacking into them, it was an effort in decomposition. It was a dismantling. It was this idea that you could break things down, and not into like just smaller parts or pieces, but that you would break it down into parts and language. And that idea of being fundamental about about this kind of digital practice, that I think is still relevant. Maybe different generations need to decide what they need to break down, but that still remains as a kind of underlying ethos in this kind of effort. So as we navigate into this new era at Cooper, I would hold on to that.
Yeah. I feel like there's a kind of, in as much as fabrication relates to technology or techniques just more broadly, that there's always this question of the control that one has over their kind of tool or their technology. And so maybe in the current state, it's just like an order of magnitude more complicated, just like more buttons and more software packages and more APIs and things like that. But I think in its underlying nature, I don't think all that much has changed in a way. But maybe it's become, the quantity of the number of mediations is so much more that it has a qualitative shift fundamentally with the way people think or work. I think that oftentimes there's when people talk about thinking through making, this is a pedagogical imperative, which I think is extremely important, and it's something that people do outside of pedagogy all of the time. Craftspeople, those who have a skill of a particular kind, and think through making, and how fabrication particularly relates to pedagogy. In this case, I think is still a kind of continuation of the foundations, as Ben said, that Cooper's had for a long time. But I think it encourages us to think as architects, not so much as though the design process starts in our head and extends outwards, as though we extend our mind into the environment with which we design in, or the materials that we design in, but in fact the materials, the tools, and the student or the learning process is all a kind of thinking unit together, rather than thought happening inside of me and then manipulating material and trying to maintain control in certain aspects and cede control in other ways. I think we understand that through these fabrication processes, what a student is, or the basic nature of what's happening when we design, is a relationship between ourselves, material, geometry, machines, and that's all a kind of learning. That's a unit in and of its own right, and that's a really exciting thing, and it's been happening for a long time. But I think that oftentimes the question of control comes up under the presupposition that I manipulate my environment, and so I must exert some kind of control on it, where I'm the source, and that's the things that are receiving my learning. Yeah, control is still there, but I'm interested in the way that the student or in teachers are not just individuals with a brain and how they think in and of their own right, but they really are a system of material, geometry, individuals themselves, and how do we cultivate that as a kind of designer is a really interesting kind of question. But with the proliferation of new tools in stoneworking or in carpentry or metal, the kind of the loss of rigor or the loss of control that happened, I think, has happened many times before, and I don't really fundamentally think it's all that much different. I don't think it's all that much.
I might argue that if architecture is being used for machines, that it's different.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
that was me my follow. I think so, but I don't know any architects who are designing those spaces, to be honest. I mean, those are largely engineered spaces, or they're not architected.
But it's amazing how amazing they are.
Yeah, I mean, we're fascinated with them for sure.
Yeah, so I'll cede my question to students if they have questions, but I'll ask my question. Okay, go for it. Yeah.
Okay. So I have a question about history and which parts of history are generative for you, because history has been generative for a lot of people in a lot of different ways, and it's a very particular part of history that is being considered generative, and there's kind of maybe a loss of an idea of history as connected to a place, although there's kind of reaching for it with being connected to kind of cultural traditions and making. But I guess I'm skeptical of how much of that tradition is actually retained once you start to control it at all. In a way, it just kind of seems like a more friendly control that might be more hard to recognize and more dangerous. And I'm just wondering why you think this is the right thing to be doing today, at this time when people seem to be losing the ability to relate and the ability to relate to their place.
Yeah.
Is my question.
That's a super interesting question. One way to look at this idea of history is that it's a fabrication, like that it is it's a fiction. It's a fiction that's kind of built up over time, and maybe that's a more apt way of describing fabrication in my presentation. I would say the opportunity is how you enter like that fiction, and how you how you decide to be an author within it. I mean, certainly, like the basket weaving is highly ritualized, but part of our risk, or part of our I guess this kind of this mask of maybe being friendly is actually like a real risk to put ourselves out there within this community. And one of the more interesting parts of that story is that the person who was most open to us is a fascinating individual who doesn't fit really any of the kind of norms of his tribe, and but he knew that he needed to do he needed to do things that really kind of made a difference. And one of the things that he does on the side of weaving, so he's a weaver, but he also runs a food cooperative where he looks at indigenous food, like beans, and tries to reintroduce them to the population. There's a huge problem of obesity and of all kinds of health problems that come out of the food that first people are eating. They're eating a lot of high fructose, high fat food, and there's a lot of there's an epidemic of all sorts of malnutrition. So while he weaves, that's only one practice of a kind of myriad of practices where he's trying to bring history back into. I mean, he's literally trying to make them eat their history so that they're healthier, and he has to do it in a way that's, the food is not. Doesn't look the same as the food that they used to eat. It has to be delivered in a way that is, that's presented in a way that they'll eat. So I think this idea of like working with history is it's not meant to be just about parts, language. It's not meant to be like just about kind of, let's say, games of logic or chance. It's meant to have a high degree of intentionality to it. It's meant to be a way of maybe slipping within the project some hope for change.
It's also interesting, just in that sense, the alternate meaning of fabrication that we've never talked about, as in like a fable or a fabricated story, is like we made it. Like, to what extent is history fabricated? We produce history. It's actively constructed in a way.
Yeah,
and it's constructed in the present all the time.
Absolutely. I mean, you could look at definitely science, art, fabrication. I mean, they're all to the degree to which their science is as much true that they are open to kind of narrative development. I mean, I've always seen this problem of working with fabrication as always dealing with this kind of this unfolding horizon. Like, you never quite get there. It's always receding in the distance. Like, you're never going to be a master of a certain technology because it's always sort of falling off. But it's important that you travel towards the horizon, because it's really this kind of journey that we're interested in, and that journey is really are really the stories along the way.
I think that idea of horizon is really interesting because it has a sense of you're looking forward and backward at the same time.
Yeah.
And so as you all were talking about this notion of control, I was thinking that, it really feels like a relinquishing if you are looking at it through the lens of authorship. But on the other hand, if you're looking at like these distribution centers from Amazon and their climate control and their automated control, you're also just allowing basically the man-made to produce this totalizing environment, right? And it's the totalizing of the man-made. And you can insert artificial intelligence into that in a way in which we're not controlling sort of the individual things that are happening in it, but it still is like 100% man-made environment. So like, is it really a relinquishing of control in the end? And I think that there might still be the possibility to have this inherited discourse of bending resources and natural processes to human will, right? So I guess I'm just wondering, as we're thinking about our placement as this horizon, about the potential to look forward into the radical potentials of the technology, but at the same time, the equally possible result of like reifying and entrenching certain assumptions of what the human place is in the world.
Yeah. I mean, I would argue that it's always a frustration of this kind of movement backwards and forwards, and the more interesting projects for us have been the ones that that reveal that. In this discourse around computation, let's say, the first computer was, is famously is the loom, right? The Jacquard loom. It was the first automated and binary mechanism that could run on its own. And binary because it was moving. It could move a thread up and down. So you could basically turn something on and off. It had like a warp and a weft. And so I would just, my answer to that question would be just a reminder that that this kind of explosion of new forms of intelligence, spaces, learning, alien, whatnot, that they're also highly material processes. And, the more we remind ourselves kind of their, let's say, their history, their origins, I think the more we're, as architects, we're able to find our agency within them. Because I think, and this is my bias, but I think architects are most powerful when dealing with material. Not really. I mean, we're great, when we handle information, code, algorithms, processes, all logistics, all that. But how it gets materialized is how it becomes cultural. Like how it gets materialized is how it becomes part of this historicity, and that's our responsibility. I think is how do you decide to place something within the world. I mean that's how I've always kind of seen it, and this idea of kind of moving backwards and forwards, the horizon. It's all a kind of fancy way of just standing for something like now.
No, I was thinking. I think part of it too is like I think it's also the realignment of like what was humanist values, right? So I think to a certain degree, like and I think we have, and every sort of construction throughout history, there's always a relationship with otherness, and so I think humanism was a response to the vast otherness of reality that they had to somehow contend with, and now I think those things aren't necessarily there. So I think there's another notion of otherness now that we basically are creating, which I think now is going to push us off center in a way, which is probably good. Yeah.
I think that also in response to what Danny brings up in terms of place, or the role of origin or ground in relation to the discussion of like fabrication between the human, the material, and the software, the interface of those two. But how that may bring a distance from the kind of the liberty of being able to take what works for that discussion and create kind of a distance from a specific place or site or an application, a more like something that could work autonomously from a place, and then the liberty and also being able to then place something in a place. I think it brings up a distance from a more largely spoken language, if that makes sense.
One thought that it makes me think of, and it's maybe reductive to what you're saying, but it's interesting how in the wave of fabrication techniques that have proliferated over the last, say, 50 years, A lot of them are pretty similar to each other. They're rather generic, and so maybe a 4x8 CNC here versus a 4x8 CNC in Brussels are kind of basically the same thing. The locality or the kind of index of history and placeness is not tangible. Maybe it is in the kind of skills or the knowledge exchange between people, but a lot of the time we talk about fabrication methods as generic methods. G-code doesn't care if it's being run in Shenzhen or New York City, right? And so I feel like there's an anxiety that architects have, knowing that's the case, is this turn towards site specificity, that like lots of things are argued to be site specific. It's like really trying to reorient itself back to a place, and I don't think that that's a bad thing per se, but I think there's a kind of an awareness of like the possibility of placelessness that can happen with a lot of modern fabrication techniques, and so a lot of projects work conscientiously, and I think a lot of it is good, and some of it maybe is gratuitous towards reconstructing a place and the kind of context through which these things happen, because a lot of them become proxies towards globalization in a totally, flat world that's pretty the same everywhere. That's a really, really complex question, but I don't know. I think that a lot of the projects that both of you shared, it's like conscientious attention to place, like Indiana produces this marble particularly, and it's like it's all a part of that fabrication system. It's constructing place, but it's also of the place in the first and foremost.
We have time for just maybe one more question. Does somebody have something that's burning in your mind that you want to get out? All right, sandwiches.
Thank you.
Professional.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks a lot.